I will begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today. And because we're all meeting in different places, I will acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I am, and they are the Gadigal and Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. It's my great pleasure today to introduce David Carment, Emeritus Professor David Carment AM. And David has had a long and distinguished career, following the completion of his PhD. David had an academic career, largely in the field of Australian history, I think almost exclusively in the field of Australian history. For much of that time, he was located at the Charles Darwin University in the Northern Territory, and where he worked there from 1983 until his retirement in 2008. He retired as the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Business and Arts. Since returning to Sydney from Darwin, he has made a close association with the Royal Australian Historical Society, serving as its president until between 2011 and 2012. Always an active supporter of community history, he's played an active role with the Mosman Historical Society, not District, Mosman Historical Society. Today, we're going to hear about something which is both topical, quite coincidentally, I think, quite topical, and also something that I think we'll all learn about a new aspect of Australian history, or a different aspect of Australian history. David is going to discuss the adventurous and dangerous flight of Waltzing Matilda, a converted Halifax bomber that reached Sydney from Britain in June 1946. It had on board men, women and children who all wished to travel to Australia as quickly as possible at a time when commercial transportation links for civilians was almost non-existent. I hear you all saying, gosh, what's different today? It was perhaps one of the most unusual flights made between Britain and Australia. And I would now like you to please join me, I should say. What am I saying? Join me in welcoming David Carment. Hello, David.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, Christine. And like you, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I'm currently located, which are the same traditional owners as where you are sitting. The first civilian passenger aircraft to reach Australia from Britain following the Second World War, and also claimed to be the first to bring migrants from Britain by air to this country, landed at Darwin on the 11th of June, 1946. A converted Halifax bomber named Waltzing Matilda. It had on board a complement of men, women and children who all wished to travel to Australia as quickly as possible at a time when commercial links for civilians were virtually non-existent. The flight attracted considerable attention and is well documented. Major newspapers and newsreels shown in cinemas reported on it frequently and prominently. As one newspaper commented, the flight was perhaps the most unusual made along what it called the England to Australia air highway. There are also comprehensive first-hand accounts. Waltzing Matilda's pilot and owner, Geoffrey Wikner, wrote his reminiscences of the journey that were published as part of his biography in 1993 and in a magazine article. A collection of his documents about the flight is held in the National Library of Australia. He was an Australian-born aircraft designer who moved to Britain in 1934 and was a wartime ferry pilot who developed new aircraft from their factories with the British Air Transport Auxiliary. One of the two flight engineers was my grandfather, Tom Sulman, hence my first interest in this topic. He described his experiences in an unpublished autobiography completed in 1969. I now have this, as well as his photographs and other documents concerning Waltzing Matilda. Sulman was an Australian automotive engineer and a racing car driver living in Britain during the 1930s, who served as a British Army officer during the war. Both Wikner and Sulman were very keen to return to Australia immediately after the war's end, but because of the shortage of transport and the priority given to people who served in the Australian Armed Services, could not do so. When he was unable to get to Australia by any other means, shortly after the end of hostilities in Europe, Wikner bought a former Royal Air Force Halifax bomber that the Royal Australian Air Force had used to undertake the journey. He then commenced the task of having the bomber converted to passenger seating, removing its armour, and convincing the relevant British authorities to consider a civil registered Halifax with a full airworthiness certificate. He chose 20 paying passengers, who included the crew members, from over 500 applicants. As far as possible, Wikner wrote, I selected men and women on a 50-50 basis to avoid quarrels should we be marooned. Among them were his wife Trudy and 2 children and a well-qualified flight crew. It was a varied group that included a young ex-Royal Air Force navigator who had won the Distinguished Flying Medal, a Royal Air Force crash boat operator, a female co-pilot, a famous acrobatic dancer, and a journalist photographer who was tasked with reporting on the flight for newspapers. Ages ranged from 2 to 70. The oldest passenger was Lady Falwell, the widow of a British judge. The charge for each person to take this far from luxurious trip was 250 British pounds, which today would be probably worth a bit more than 16,000 Australian dollars. As Wikner later wrote, there were serious obstacles that had to be overcome before Waltzing Matilda's journey began. And I quote from him here, there were 9 frustrating months of seemingly endless red tape, during which the Air Ministry, the Foreign Office, Handley Page Limited, and the Bristol Aeroplane Company all tried to stop the flight from taking place. However, de Havilland's very kindly overhauled the propellers free of charge, and Dunlop gave me a new set of tyres. Other companies kindly donated items free, including emergency rations. Shell organised the supply of food, and I paid them £2,000 in advance. They did a very fine job, and there were no hitches on their account. My flight was to be the first made to Australia as a privately owned aircraft after the war, and I was up against it from the start. I was told I could not use RAF aerodromes. In fact, that was an instruction which he disobeyed, although we were using the old RAF Transport Command routes. No maps of the route were available, but Transport Command kindly provided a manual which consisted mostly of radio aids and a few aerodrome maps. The aerodrome maps were not important. It was finding the aerodromes that mattered. Most of the flight was made using a Daily Telegraph map of the world and local knowledge gained from the staging posts as we proceeded. End of quote. On the 16th of May 1946, permission was finally given that the newly named Waltzing Matilda could take off. It was only finally allowed to do so when all those whom Wikner accepted formally agreed to a strict set of conditions. Before joining what was officially described as an exhibition flight that would raise money for the Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund and the Royal Australian Air Force Welfare Fund. They were instructed to have British international passports validated for the many countries they were expected to visit, and military and other visas. They also had to be vaccinated against a variety of diseases. They were not allowed to have more than 45 kilograms each of luggage that included sleeping equipment and eating utensils, and carry specified emergency rations. The crew and passengers were probably aware of the potential risks. Far more aircraft crashed in the 1940s than now, and there were many perils along the proposed route, including growing anti-colonial agitation and insurgency in parts of South and Southeast Asia. In spite of press reports saying how well Waltzing Matilda's journey went, it would be both adventurous and dangerous. Once all the potential travellers were inoculated and their passports and visas were in order and permission for the flight arrived, Wikner decided to get going before the authorities changed their minds. He sent telegrams to everyone to be ready to depart from Herne Aerodrome in southern England on the 24th of May 1946. Shortly before they did so, Wikner was interviewed for British Pathé News with some of the passengers and crews gathered around him. Wikner, who had never before flown a fully loaded large aircraft, ordered that heavy baggage be stored in the tail. The passengers sat in canvas seats or were spread around the aircraft in various crew positions. After running up the engines and testing the controls, at 4:30 AM, he taxied Waltzing Matilda out to the runway and was authorised to leave. The aircraft only just managed to lift off, barely clearing trees at the end of the runway. It circled round and round, like Silman later wrote, a constipated duck, and could not make any height. So the crew carried the heaviest luggage from the tail to the navigator's cabin. Gradually, the aircraft came back on an even keel. Due to the problems encountered, Wikner decided to land at Marseille in France instead of Tunis in Tunisia as intended. Next morning, Waltzing Matilda went on to Castelveneto in Libya, travelling across Corsica and hitting Africa at Cape Bon. Leaving at daybreak the following morning, it flew along the African coast, the scene of the heartbreaking reverses and the eventual victory of the Allied forces. The desert was still crisscrossed with tank tracks and littered with burnt-out aircraft and vehicles. Waltzing Matilda did a circle of Tobruk in honour of the Australians who defended the town, the harbour of which was cluttered with sunken shipping, and flew in over the Nile and the pyramids to Cairo in Egypt. A day was spent checking the aircraft and fitting air scoops to cool the interior, as it had proved very hot and stuffy. From Cairo, Waltzing Matilda followed a pipeline until it veered off to the north. The decision was made to turn south in the hope of picking up the Euphrates River and following it down to Basra in Iraq, the next stopover. Instead, there were hundreds of kilometres of flooded land, the trees sticking up like fingers above the muddy waters. There were no landmarks, and time was running out before refuelling would be necessary. C.B. Scott, the experienced navigator, proved his worth when at last the Basra aerodrome came into view. The heat was intense, and by the time the crew members finished overseeing refuelling, the wings were burning through their shoes. Leaving again at daybreak, the weather was still hot, but it was bearable. Waltzing Matilda flew down the eastern coast of the Persian Gulf over Bahrain, from where the oil sheen went way out into the sea. Worried about the fuel supply lasting to India, Wikner landed instead at a Royal Air Force fighter station in the desert town of Sharjah in the Arabian Peninsula. Due to the glare from the sand and the heat, Waltzing Matilda fell hard onto the airstrip from about 5 metres and then bounced several times. Scott swore afterwards that the first 2 bounces showed on the altimeter. Wikner managed to steady the aircraft and taxied up to a fort, which looked like something out of the film Beau Geste. Inside was a large courtyard surrounded by green awnings, the rooms also being green, with pictures of the English countryside on the walls. It was wonderfully soothing after the dazzling glare and heat of the desert outside. Waltzing Matilda's crew and passengers lay back and relaxed in cane chairs, enjoying large ice lemon drinks. A British serviceman informed them that he was one of the original crew of the aircraft and that it had always been considered a lucky ship. They hoped he was right. As soon as they had to leave, they discovered that there was a nasty shock before them. They were told the runway was only about 1,300 metres long, shorter than normally needed to take off, and Waltzing Matilda had a full fuel load. The moment Wikner felt the wheels leave the ground, he signalled for the undercarriage to be lifted. Even then, the aircraft only just managed to scrape over the sand dunes at the runway's edge. Karachi, then in India and now in Pakistan, was reached without any more drama. Because of the heat, it was decided not to work on the aircraft that day and to stay 2 nights. On the following day, the crew once again checked the aircraft, trying to find a mysterious hydraulic oil leak without any success. Perhaps even more worrying, the aircraft's directional gyro that was used for navigation was discovered to be malfunctioning. Karachi engineers repaired it, but it now worked in reverse, showing that if the pilots wanted to fly east, they needed to head west. The second night was so hot, even with enormous punkahs over beds, that several of the crew and passengers got dressed, hired a taxi, and then drove around the city until they left at daybreak. Crossing the Sindh desert, Waltzing Matilda approached the Indian city of Jodhpur. A wireless message warned of a sandstorm approaching. Wikner was told to land at the closest Royal Air Force airstrip without delay. The red and yellow cloud reaching high into the sky for some time had already puzzled him and others on board, so he landed as quickly as possible. The crew only just had time to lash tarpaulin covers over the engines and to make everything fast before the storm was upon them. The sun disappeared and an eerie half-light took its place. The wind howled and the sand enveloped them, so they were very glad to take shelter. The Royal Air Force had access to an enclosed swimming pool at the local Maharaja's Palace, in which most of the Waltzing Matilda party spent the rest of the day, as it was stiflingly hot. After a one-night stop at Calcutta in India, Waltzing Matilda ran into very heavy thunderstorms, the forerunner of the monsoons that had been hoped to beat. A wide detour was made out to sea. Wikner was worried about finding the next port of call at Pegu in Burma, now Myanmar, an airstrip in the jungle not far from Rangoon. The visibility was so bad that he flew in very low. Scott, the able navigator, found the destination despite a complete absence of landmarks and the aircraft's wireless set having a range of only about 15 kilometres. As Waltzing Matilda touched down, there was a terrific noise that shook all on board until they realised that the airstrip was paved with steel slats to stop aircraft bogging in the mud. A tyre was badly punctured. There was only a skeleton Royal Air Force staff to look after the needs of aircraft passing through, and a company of Sikh soldiers to provide security. The rains went on. Advice was received not to continue the journey until the weather cleared. With no oxygen tanks and children on board, the safe ceiling was about 4,000 metres. It was, however, necessary to cross a mountain range of approximately 5,000 metres with only one gap through which to go. Clad in bathing trunks, crew members checked over the aircraft, trying to eliminate the numerous leaks in the fuselage revealed in the heavy rains, and once again unsuccessfully attempted to discover the elusive hydraulic oil leak. After 5 days in Pegu, during which everyone suffered from numerous insect bites and some crew members went hunting, it was decided to take off at dawn and try to get through the gap in the mountains, much against the advice of the local Air Force meteorologist. Climbing up through the clouds, Waltzing Matilda came out in the sunlight. Skimming through the top of the cloud bank, the crew was able to pick out the gap through which the aircraft had to pass. After landing at Bangkok in Thailand to refuel, crew and passengers had a light meal at the airport, bought some of the famed local silver jewellery, and was soon off again down the Malay Peninsula to Singapore. At Singapore, the Royal Air Force was very loath to let Waltzing Matilda continue and insisted on a long-range wireless set being fitted. The aircraft was rerouted via Balikpapan in what was then Dutch Borneo, as the much more direct route over Java was too dangerous. Indonesian nationalists engaged in a war of independence against the Dutch were firing at aircraft going that way. Balikpapan Airport, or aerodrome, was practically deserted. Only a handful of Dutch personnel were left there, with no equipment and very little food. Waltzing Matilda was thoroughly checked for the long hop across the Timor Sea to Darwin, but the oil leak, which was getting worse, could still not be located. To make matters even more complicated, there was no hydraulic oil available. So with much trepidation, coconut oil was used instead, the crew hoping that the heat would keep it liquid enough. Inflatable dinghies and life jackets were carefully checked. At dawn, after 2 days stopover, the flight resumed. The only large landmass seen after Borneo was Timor. The new wireless set proved useless, as the sole station the radio operator could raise was in Hong Kong. At last, after about 7 hours flying, the Australian coastline, a barren, mangrove-covered shore, came into view. Probably because of the idiosyncratic navigation system, Waltzing Matilda missed Bathurst and Melville Islands and now seemed lost. The radio operator could still not raise Darwin. Crew members correctly determined that they were about 100 kilometres too far west. Waltzing Matilda quickly turned east and flew low to make sure the coconut oil would be liquid enough when the flaps and undercarriage were lowered. This resulted in a bumpy ride as the plane landed without further misadventure to what the Sydney Morning Herald described as a rousing welcome at Darwin's Royal Australian Air Force Base. After the landing, staff members at the base quickly noticed that Waltzing Matilda's exhaust stack was hanging on by just one small bolt. Sulman climbed up into the outer casing of the engine to inspect the damage and found the mysterious hydraulic oil leak. a hairline crack in the casing that only opened up when hot. The Air Force workshops repaired the exhaust pipe and welded a new casing, but had no suitable gasket to install. A jam jar rubber ring that was the right size was fitted instead, and everyone hoped for the best. Waltzing Matilda's crew members made the most of their first day in Australia. Although Darwin was still badly damaged from the many Japanese air attacks on the town, they were able to find an open Chinese cafe there. When Sulman wrote, and I quote, "The waitress wheeled off the menu, steak and eggs, chops and eggs, etc., etc., the expressions of the crew members' faces were intriguing. After severe rationing in England, they just could not believe it. We all had steak and eggs and large banana splits. We had not seen bananas or ice cream since the beginning of the war." Halfway back to the airbase, Scotty, that is Scott the navigator, said, "I still don't believe it," and ordered the taxi to turn around and go back to the cafe. He went in and asked the waitress if she had seen him before and whether he had steak and eggs and a banana split. She looked at him as if he were a lunatic and asked, "You barmy or something? Of course you did." Scotty replied, "I still don't believe it. Bring it on again." And we all joined him. None of us slept too well that night. Our stomachs just could not take it. From Darwin, Waltzing Matilda flew on to Sydney with a stop in Cloncurry in Queensland, whose residents warmly greeted the aircraft and entertained those on it. As it neared its final destination, however, there was still no sign of Sydney. Wikner wrote, and I quote, "We were too far west. I headed from the coast and searched for landmarks, and sure enough, I recognised the Hydro Majestic on the Blue Mountains, where I had spent many a pleasant Christmas evening when I was single." Wikner tempted fate at the last moment when he flew a circuit around Sydney Harbour, but made a perfect landing. His 9-year-old son, Ken, was allowed to sit in the nose cone, where he enjoyed a spectacular view of Sydney as all this happened. Customs officers and a crowd of about 200 people, mostly relatives and friends of those on Waltzing Matilda, were at Sydney's mascot airport, as it was then known, to greet the aircraft's arrival there with a rousing cheer on the afternoon of the 15th of June. All this, however, did not prevent customs staff from almost immediately advising Wikner that he had to pay a 12.5% sales tax on the aircraft's value. Waltzing Matilda's flight from England had taken 73 hours and 27 minutes actual flying time. Wikner was so exhausted that he vowed never to fly an aircraft again. To the best of my knowledge, he never did. As Waltzing Matilda was the first Halifax in Australia, Wikner had to take it on a fundraising exhibition there. Despite extensive efforts, he was unable to organise the necessary support. He offered the aircraft to the Royal Australian Air Force and as a gift to the Australian War Memorial, but both declined to take it. Waltzing Matilda was sold to an air freight company. After just one flight, it was allowed to rot at Bankstown in Sydney. The fuselage was finally destroyed when it was used for a fire drill. It was an undignified end for an aircraft that achieved so much. Waltzing Matilda is, though, appropriately memorialised at Halifax Holiday Park, which is in Nelson Bay to the north of Sydney. Geoffrey Wikner and his wife Trudy established the plaque not long after they settled down in Sydney. A plaque there reads, and I quote from it, Halifax Park. This park was named after Halifax heavy bomber NR 169 HDT, flown by crews of 466 Squadron RAAF on 51 raids over Germany with RAF Bomber Command during World War II. Named Waltzing Matilda, it was flown to Australia by Captain G.N. Wikner in 1946. Geoff and Trudy Wikner established the park in that year. This plaque commemorates the aircraft, the flight, and the gallant crew. Specifications: Handley Page Halifax B Mark III, maximum weight 65,000 pounds. Engines 4 by 1,650 horsepower British Hercules. Speed 225 miles per hour. Bomb load 15,000 pounds. Fuel 2,500 gallons. Range 2,800 miles. Well, Tom Sulman died in 1970 and Geoffrey Wikner in 1990. His son, Ken Wikner, is also dead. I was unsuccessful, unfortunately, in discovering during my recent research if any others on the flight are still alive. I suspect it's unlikely. The story of Waltzing Matilda's 1946 journey reminds us of how greatly passenger flights changed after then. When I travelled on Qantas Flight 2 from London to Sydney in October 2018, the flight took about 23 hours. That included one quite short stopover in Singapore. In real terms, the cost of my ticket was very much lower than the amount Waltzing Matilda's passengers paid for their far less comfortable ride. It was a great contrast to Waltzing Matilda's adventures in 1946. However, as Christine reminded us in her introduction, there is one striking similarity with today. Thousands of Australians in Britain are like some of Waltzing Matilda's passengers and crew, anxious to return to their home country at a time when there are very considerable difficulties in doing so. And thank you for listening to me.
David, we have one question at the moment. And so one of our, Christine asks, are there any photographs from the journey apart from the ones in the newspapers?
There are some photographs of the journey, some of which I have, which were taken by the journalist on board. Those were taken for associated newspapers, which I think had a few newspapers. There are some photographs as well in the Wikner collection in the National Library. Unfortunately, not all the journey was properly photographed because there was a problem with the developing of some of the film that was taken. I think what happened was that during that very wet stopover at Pegu in Burma, the film which had been taken on part of the journey until then could not be properly developed. And so there is a bit of a gap.
Oh.
So we have a question from Jane. Jane asks, what an extraordinary adventure. I wonder if any diaries or journals will ever emerge from the participants, other than, I guess, Tom Sulman's, which you've managed to uncover.
Yes, I suspect it's unlikely. Much of what I had to say was based on Sulman's autobiography and Wikner's biography and autobiography and the newspaper accounts. I've not been able to locate any other unpublished sources at any rate. So I suspect they probably don't exist, or if they did exist, they don't any longer, which is a bit of a shame. And it's also a pity that I only started to do serious research on this about 7 or 8 years ago. And by that stage, I wasn't able to find any people who had lived long enough for me to talk to them. Although I did discover only last year when I was putting together some material on this, that Geoffrey Wikner's son had been alive until a few years ago, but unfortunately I wasn't aware of that. But that is a pity, although he did provide a very interesting account, which I used for a newspaper in Newcastle, which was where he lived for much of the period after he grew up.
Phil Weber asks a bit of a personal question. He asked, would you rather the 1946's Adventure or the 2018's Speed?
For me, I would prefer the speed and the safety, but I'm a bit of a coward when it comes to flying, so I would prefer not to have that kind of adventure. But I guess there are some people who might like the more adventurous experience, but I'm certainly not one of them.
We have one from Jennifer Rowland, and she says, fascinating talk, David. The children on the flight might still be alive. Have you advertised widely? I
haven't advertised, and she is right. It's possible they are, but if they were still alive, they would be around about 80 and a bit above 80. And there were only a few of them. There were only 3 children on the flight. But I haven't advertised, and that is a good suggestion. I do want to do some more work on this. So I'll take up Jenny's suggestion and see whether some kind of advertising reaches out to anyone.
Question from Lance. The aircraft seems to be extremely weather beaten, with large areas of paint missing on arrival in Australia. Are there any photos available showing this extreme wear?
The only ones I could find are the ones I showed, but it certainly was very weather beaten. I suspect that it wasn't in great condition so far as the paintwork was concerned when it took off from England. I've only got black and white photos, but they indicate that even then it was a bit battered as far as its exterior was concerned, and it's quite likely that having flown a number of bombing missions and then being bought by Wikner, that he decided that there were more important things to do with the aircraft than to attend to its paintwork.
Annie asks, can you tell us anything else about the female co-pilot? Was this unusual at the time?
Well, her name was Aubrey Morgan, and she had flown with the Air Transport Auxiliary during the Second World War. There were female pilots, some quite well-known female pilots in the sort of golden age of aviation pioneering in the period between the 2 wars. But male pilots greatly outnumbered female pilots. Hers is quite an interesting story. She wasn't an Australian, she was English, and she was quite young. She was only in her early to mid-20s. She'd never been to Australia. She didn't really have any Australian connections, but for her it was an adventure. She wanted to come to Australia and to have a look around. And I did try and follow her up a bit using the wonders of Trove to search newspapers. And all I could find was her appearing at a social event in Sydney a year or so after the flight. And after that, I just wasn't able to track her down. So I don't know whether she stayed in Australia or whether she returned to Britain. And of course, it's quite possible too that she got married and changed her name. And in that case, even Trove is not a lot of help unless you know what the married name is going to be. But yeah, she was a particularly good pilot. And it was to Wikner's credit, I think, that he took her on as the co-pilot.
We have another question from Christine. Christine says, thank you, and what a great talk. It was definitely a great talk. And the question is, has the story been recounted on newsreels of the day?
There were newsreels, and had my sort of technical abilities been better, I could have incorporated them in my talk, but that was just a bit beyond me. But I did find 2 newsreels, and I've watched them, and one was from Pathé News. I think the other one, if I can remember correctly, was Movietone News. These were newsreels taken at the beginning of the flight, and I think the other one was taken when it landed in Sydney. So I had one when Wikner was interviewed just before the flight started, and another one which was of the flight after it had arrived in Sydney. And I don't think there were any newsreels that would have been taken between the beginning and the end, although I could be wrong there, but certainly I didn't discover them in my online searching. But the interview with Wikner, which was filmed as a newsreel and shown in cinemas, was particularly interesting. And I regret that I wasn't able to include it in my presentation. There was also a fairly hefty fee I discovered as well, which was another disincentive for wanting to include it.
Well, thank you, everyone. And I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and we hope to see you soon.
And thank you, Philip and Christine.
Thank you, Dave.